The first time she walked into that bank, she was not thinking about power. She was thinking about her granddaughter's car. The car was old. It rattled in cold weather and made a small, complaining sound every time it turned left, but it was how the girl got to her nursing classes on the other side of town. Without it, those early morning buses with 2 transfers would become a wall instead of a path. The girl had asked her grandmother for help with the repair bill. The amount was not large by most standards. New brakes, a few hoses, labor, a number that would not impress anyone in a suit. But it was large enough that the granddaughter could not cover it in 1 month without falling behind on her rent. The grandmother's name was Evelyn Brooks. Most people called her Miss Evelyn. She was 71, with silver hair she wore in a soft bun and hands that had known both cotton fields and keyboards. She raised children, then grandchildren, and in between, she worked as a secretary, a hotel cleaner, a church treasurer, a babysitter, and anything else life demanded. Over the years, she had learned how to make a little stretch far, but this time, she wanted to do something simple. Borrow a small sum, pay it back in an orderly way, and let the car and the granddaughter keep moving. The bank sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, in a building that had once been a department store. It had tall glass windows and a high ceiling just inside the doors, as if someone wanted customers to think of cathedrals when they thought of interest rates. There were comfortable chairs in the lobby and a coffee machine that made drinks with foam on top. On the walls hung photographs of smiling families holding new house keys and standing in front of freshly bought trucks. Evelyn had been walking past it for years. She had watched it change hands twice, watched the logos and slogans shift like seasons. The current one promised partnership, community, and trust. The words sounded good enough. She had never asked them for anything before. She walked through the glass doors in her best coat, carrying a folder with all the things she had been told mattered. A printout of her pension deposits, a record of her church treasurer work, a list of the bills she had paid on time for decades: electricity, water, phone, taxes. She did not know that the system behind the counters did not have a little box for all the quiet, careful ways someone holds a life together. There was a line inside. Young people checking their balances on phones while they waited. A man in a construction vest cashing a check. An older woman arguing about a fee. Evelyn waited her turn, fingers resting on the folder as if it might blow away. When she reached the front, the teller listened politely, then said that a manager needed to review loan requests. It sounded reasonable. She was asked to sit and wait in one of the comfortable chairs. The manager appeared after several minutes. He was in his 40s, with hair that had been trained to lie perfectly to one side and a tie that matched the bank's colors. On his name badge, below his name, were tiny letters that read, "Branch Manager." He smiled as he sat across from her. Evelyn explained what she needed: the sum, the reason, the plan to pay it back from her pension and small income from church work over a short period. She slid her folder across the table, papers neatly arranged. The manager opened it and glanced through. He nodded at certain lines, frowned slightly at others. He typed something into his computer. He shook his head a little, the way people do when reading a weather report that promises rain. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, concerned, and full of a kind of care that did not feel like care. He talked about risk. He talked about how fixed incomes could be fragile. He mentioned trends in the economy, how older borrowers sometimes underestimated emergencies. He said that sometimes people in her situation took on obligations that ended up hurting them. He used phrases that sounded protective. For her own good, better to be cautious, hate to see you struggle. He suggested she ask family members for help or perhaps find a charity program. He listed options that did not involve the bank taking any risk at all. What he did not mention was that the bank had just approved a much larger line of credit that week for a younger customer with less steady income, but a different color of skin, who came in wearing a suit and spoke confidently about leveraging opportunities. That young man's numbers did not look noticeably better on paper, but his story matched the one the bank liked to tell about itself. Evelyn listened. The words washed over her like lukewarm water. Somewhere inside that stream of concern, she understood the basic answer. No. The manager's gaze softened while he explained again that the bank had to think about profiles and likelihoods. He said he'd seen too many older customers get trapped in debt, and it was his job to protect people from unwise decisions. He appeared to believe himself. She sat very still as he talked. Somewhere behind his head, a framed slogan promised that every dream mattered. When he was finished, she collected her papers slowly, careful not to tear or crumple anything. She put them back in her folder, folded her hands on top, and thanked him for his time. She did not argue. She did not plead. Years of moving through systems that smiled and said no had taught her that shouting rarely changed outcomes. It only wrote her down in a different file, under a different label. She walked out of the bank and into the bright daylight, the automatic doors sighing behind her. On the sidewalk, she paused. The car still needed brakes. The granddaughter still needed the car. The numbers had not changed. But something in Evelyn's chest had shifted slightly, like a piece of furniture nudged out of its usual spot. The refusal itself did not surprise her. The tone did. The way the manager had spoken as if she were not sitting there with a lifetime of keeping things afloat, but as if she were a child asking for candy instead of medicine. She went home and called her granddaughter. They agreed to stretch things, to see what could be done, to pay for the repair slowly, in pieces, with help from others who didn't have marble floors in their offices. Life went on. The bank remained on the corner, its windows shining. Then, by one of those quiet chains of events that begin in a place far from polished counters, a flyer appeared on the notice board at Evelyn's church. It was simple, a sheet of white paper with black letters and a small logo in the corner. It announced a meeting about a new credit union forming in the neighborhood. The words said phrases she had not seen on bank posters: member-owned, community control, financial justice. At the bottom, it mentioned that the union would be led by a group of black financial professionals who wanted to bring tools to people who'd been told too often that loans were never for them. On the Sunday the flyer went up, Evelyn almost did not notice it. Her hands were full of collection envelopes and notes from the pastor about the upcoming fundraiser. But something made her pause and read. A week later, she went to the meeting. It was held in the basement of the old community center 2 blocks from the church. The room smelled of coffee and folding chairs. A handful of people sat scattered at tables, elders from neighboring congregations, a young couple with a baby, a man in a work jacket. At the front, a group of 4 people stood by a whiteboard. They introduced themselves simply. A former bank loan officer tired of turning away people who reminded him of his own parents. An accountant who had watched clients get trapped by fees. A lawyer with experience in credit union law. And a woman who had managed a branch in another state and wanted to build something different here. They talked about what a credit union is when it is done right. Not charity, not a handout. A place where the depositors are also the owners, where votes are counted and policies are shaped by members, not distant shareholders. They explained how capital could be pooled, how small loans could be structured in ways that respected both risk and reality. Evelyn listened, arms folded at first, skepticism sitting on her shoulder like a bird. She had heard promises before, but as they spoke, they did something the bank manager had not done. They described people like her as responsible adults with histories, not as problems to be managed. They spoke of grandmothers who had raised entire families on patchwork incomes, of veterans whose credit reports did not show the months they had covered neighbors' bills, of people who had been told no in polite voices so many times that they had stopped asking. At the end, they passed around sign-up sheets. They were not ready to issue loans yet, the organizers said. First, they had to build membership, raise a base of deposits, secure the regulatory approvals. It would take time, but if people believed in the idea, they invited them to become founding members. Evelyn took the pen. She wrote her name carefully on the line. Under initial deposit, she wrote an amount that would not change any balances in corporate boardrooms, but that meant something to her. It was the same sum the bank had refused to lend her. The months that followed were slow and steady. The credit union rented a small office above a laundromat. They bought used desks and computers. They invited people in to talk about their finances without shame. They helped some members untangle knots of fees and late charges. They set up savings accounts for grandchildren with $10 at a time. The loan committee met in the evenings. Evelyn was not on it. She didn't feel qualified. She joined a different committee, one that focused on outreach and member education. She spoke to elders at church, to friends at the senior center, to neighbors sitting on stoops. She told them about the difference between a place that lent you money and a place where you and your neighbors decided together how money would flow. The granddaughter eventually fixed her car. The repairs were paid in installments with help from family and a small emergency grant the credit union arranged through a partner program. It was not easy, but it was done. As the years turned, the larger banking world shifted. A recession came like a slow tide, washing away careful plans and revealing cracks in marble floors. Some branches of big banks in their city closed quietly. Others stayed open, but cut staff. The branch on Main and 3rd remained, but its numbers were not what they had been. The bank's headquarters, located in a different state, watched spreadsheets and grew uneasy. Meanwhile, the credit union grew. It did not grow in a dramatic headline-grabbing way. It grew like roots under a sidewalk, steady and patient. Members told other members. Churches moved small portions of their reserves. A few local businesses opened accounts. Deposit by deposit, the foundation thickened. One spring, the credit union board received a proposal from the larger network they had joined. Several failing branches of a regional bank were up for sale. The bank wanted to shed locations that had become more trouble than they were worth. Among the branches listed was the one on Main and 3rd. The network believed that having a strong, local, member-owned institution take over those locations could be good for everyone, for residents, for regulators, for the idea of community finance itself. They asked if the credit union was ready to step into a larger role. The board hesitated. It was a big step. Owning a branch meant more responsibility, more scrutiny, more work. But it also meant something else, a chance to sit at a table where decisions were usually made without their presence. They ran the numbers twice, then a third time. They talked to members. They spoke with lawyers and accountants. In the end, the decision was made carefully, not with fanfare, but with a clear sense of what it meant. The credit union would purchase the assets of the branch on Main and 3rd and convert it into one of their own locations under their own policies, guided by their own committees. A meeting was set between the bank's representatives and the credit union's oversight committee to finalize the transition details. They chose a date. They chose a room. The conference room on the 2nd floor of the very building Evelyn had walked into years before, with her folder and her hope. By this time, Evelyn had become more than a quiet member. She had joined the supervisory committee, the group that reviewed how the credit union operated and made sure decisions followed both law and conscience. She had not planned it. Someone had simply noticed that the woman who kept the church's books with such precision might be a good person to help watch over this new institution. On the day of the meeting, she dressed not in her Sunday best, but in clothes that made her feel steady. A deep blue dress, a cardigan, comfortable shoes. She carried a notebook and a pen, like she had for decades in other rooms where other decisions were made. She arrived early, the bank's staff, still operating the branch until the transition was complete, watched the people coming and going with a mix of curiosity and unease. They had heard rumors. Some worried about their jobs. Others wondered who would be in charge now. When the bank's delegation entered the conference room, the branch manager led them. His hair was thinner now, and there were lines on his forehead that had not been there before, but he still walked with that careful, practiced confidence learned in training sessions about leadership. He sat on one side of the table with a folder of his own. Corporate representatives sat next to him. Across from them, the credit union's leaders took their seats: the former loan officer, the accountant, the lawyer, and the members of the supervisory committee. Evelyn sat among them, calm and upright. The manager glanced around the table. His eyes passed over her once, then slid back in surprise and recognition. It took him a moment to place her, to reconcile the image of an older black woman asking for a car repair loan, with the presence of that same woman sitting now as part of the group purchasing the building beneath his feet. There was a flicker in his expression, something between confusion and discomfort. Then he rearranged his features into a professional neutral. The meeting began. They discussed liabilities and assets. They reviewed leases and service contracts. They went over details about vaults, safe deposit boxes, teller lines, customer notifications. The language was dry, but under it ran a current of something sharper. From time to time, questions about community impact and member treatment arose. The credit union representatives spoke plainly about their priorities. They emphasized transparency. They used phrases like open-door policy and local decision-making. They described metrics that were not just about profit, but about access. Evelyn did not speak often. When she did, it was to ask simple, pointed questions. She asked who would inform older customers of the transition and how exactly it would be explained. She asked what would happen to small automatic payments, utility bills, church donations that senior citizens had set up years before and barely remembered. She asked whether there were any hidden fees that might surprise elderly account holders in the shift. The bank representatives answered. Sometimes they answered well. Sometimes they had to flip through pages to find the information they should have had ready. Each time she asked something, the manager's eyes flicked toward her, then away. At one point, during a short break, he approached her with that same soft, concerned expression he had used years earlier, though this time he seemed unsure how to deploy it. He said that he hoped everything would be handled smoothly, that he cared deeply about customers, that the decision to close the branch had not been his. He said many words that circled around a smaller truth neither of them spoke out loud. That once, in this building, he had decided she was not worth the bank's risk, and now she sat in a chair that helped decide the bank's fate. Evelyn listened politely. She nodded at appropriate moments. She did not remind him of their previous meeting. She did not need to. It hung between them like a picture only they could see. When the break ended, she returned to her seat on the credit union side of the table. By the time the papers were signed and the hands shaken, nothing visible in the room had changed. The walls were the same color. The chairs were the same chairs. The windows still let in the same light on Main and 3rd. Yet something in the structure of power had shifted. Soon, the logo on the front of the building would change. So would the brochures inside. The photographs on the walls would not all look the same. Some would show elders whose faces had never been considered good marketing material before. Some would show the people who actually sat with them, counted their pills, and helped them keep their lives intact. The loan policies would change too. There would still be risk assessments and conditions and rejections. A credit union was not magic. But there would also be more questions about context, about history, about patterns of harm. There would be more conversations that began from the assumption that people like Evelyn were not children who needed protecting from themselves, but adults who deserved honest tools. When people later told the story, they often shortened it. They said a black grandmother had once been refused a loan by a bank manager who spoke down to her, and that later she had returned as part of the group that bought his branch. They liked the neatness of that arc, the sense of satisfaction. For Evelyn, the meaning lived in smaller details. It lived in the moment she signed the papers as a member owner rather than a supplicant. It lived in the first time she watched an elder walk into the remodeled lobby and be greeted by name, not as a potential risk, but as part of the reason the place existed at all. It lived in the quiet fact that somewhere, on some spreadsheet in a headquarters far away, a line now recorded that a branch once considered underperforming had been transferred not to another corporation, but to a room full of people like the woman who had been told in a gentle voice that she was too fragile to trust with a small sum of money. She knew the world was not fixed. She knew other banks on other corners would still say no in ways that sounded like concern. She knew that credit unions, like churches and families, could lose their way if people stopped paying attention. But as she walked past the building on Main and 3rd now, and saw the new sign over the door, she allowed herself one small, private thought. There had been a time when she sat on the other side of that glass, folder in hand, waiting to be judged. Now, people walked through those doors, knowing that somewhere in the structure above them, their voices were counted, and one of those voices belonged to an old woman with silver hair who had finally been allowed to decide where the money went. It was not revenge. It was not even victory in the loud sense. It was something quieter and more lasting, a change in who sat at the table, and a proof that the same hands that kept a family going for 50 years could, when given the chance, help steer a bank.